When I first started to study gold and silver about 15 years ago, one of the first conclusions I drew was that fiat money was undesirable and that we needed to return to sound money, which meant a return to the gold standard. Now that I've had a good long while to study the nature of money, currency, and trade, I can state with confidence that some of my assumptions were incorrect. I would like to share with you my current thinking. I will share with you my conclusions that, first, money and currency are useful and serve very different purposes. Second, currency's job is to circulate while money's job is to sit very still, and its main value is as a mental marker for comparing the value of one thing against another. 3. One is for facilitating transactions, the other is for savings. 4. Many of our problems arise because people treat currency as a store of value. 5. The need to unlock oil's value forced us off the gold standard. Please enjoy the presentation. I look forward to some lively and productive discussion in the comments section, as I'm sure many of you will disagree with some of my assertions, but that's how we learn from each other. So let's get to it. We all know in the back of our heads the approximate value of various items, especially those that we buy all of the time. We can keep a mental account of the relative value of hundreds of items at a time. It's really quite remarkable. But what makes this possible? Well, the answer is currency. It acts as a reference point, a marker for all transactions. In this picture, one person makes a note that his 10 pounds of copper can buy 6 bushels of corn. Another person notes that they can buy 10 bushels of corn in return for 1 day of their labor. How did they do this? Did they memorize the relative pricing of the various items? No. They use currency as a reference point and do a calculation. The first person knows that his copper is worth $3.36 a pound. The second person knows that his labor is worth $7.25 per hour. They both know that corn is worth $5.46 per bushel. Once they know this, the relative value between corn, copper, or corn and labor is really just simple math. So it is really the assignment of a number to every good or service that enables this mental calculation to be made. It is this mental calculation that is the primary function of currency. But what sets the scale? If the vertical axis were changed suddenly, but the relative values of all of the items remained the same, what would be the effects? Let's find out. Here, we've arbitrarily changed the vertical axis. By magic, all of the relative values reestablish themselves at the same points. In reality, it would take some time for prices to adjust, but for now, let's just assume that they adjust instantaneously. The first person can still exchange his 10 pounds of copper for 6 bushels of corn, and the other can still obtain 10 bushels of corn in exchange for a day's labor. Note, so long as the relative values adjust instantaneously, everybody's happy. That is, except for the guy crying in the upper left-hand corner, but we'll get to him in a moment. So we see that it really doesn't matter what number we assign to everything as long as the relative pricing is correct. And what sets those relative values is the amount of effort and resources required to produce each of them. It doesn't matter if we price our corn in a unit called dollars or in a unit called yen. In the end, people will be able to perform the mental calculations needed to make exchanges. What will make the copper guy or labor guy unhappy, though, is if we change the scale of the currency suddenly and the prices of the things that they want go up faster than the prices of the things that they have to offer. This is definitely a problem, but not nearly as big a problem as the guy in the upper left-hand corner of the page is experiencing. The gentleman crying has lost about 99% of his buying power because he saved his surplus in the wrong thing. By suddenly changing the definition of the currency, his claims on future goods and services change dramatically. This is lesson number 1. Don't save in items that can be revalued quickly. Credit crises have happened frequently throughout history because people have chosen to save in currency. And as I'll explain later, currency must be able to change in value in order to increase society's standard of living. This is really a difficult concept to wrap your head around, but bear with me, I'll get there in a moment. To understand why currency should be flexible in terms of quantity and value, we need to first understand its second main form of utility. We often hear someone say, he has all of his money in the stock market, or he put all of his money into gold. These can be very misleading statements if you take them at face value. The reality is that a person traded his currency in return for stocks or for gold. The currency doesn't sit inside the asset. It now resides with another person who traded their stocks or their gold for currency. Exchanges do not take currency out of circulation. Exchanges just move the currency around. Currency is like a water current or an electrical current. It moves and it flows. It's not meant to sit still. If electricity or water stops moving, there is no longer a current. By the same reasoning, if currency stops moving, it no longer functions as currency. You see, currency does not go into assets, it flows through them. And it always flows in the opposite direction to the flow of assets. Because currency facilitates the movement of goods and services, we can see how velocity of currency and the velocity of goods and services are tightly related. If the velocity of currency falls, then the rate of exchange of goods and services falls with it. Now suppose that society as a whole wants to increase the frequency at which they trade goods and services. We'll examine an example in a minute. What would happen, or what would have to happen, in order to make this possible? Suppose we were to increase the frequency at which assets circulate but keep the amount of currency in circulation fixed. Then we would need for either the general price level to drop or for the velocity of the currency to increase. The former is an instance of change in the value of currency, which points to the need for flexibility of currency value. The latter creates some problems of its own. It's very difficult to increase the velocity of currency without changing the amount of circulation as well. The reason goes back to stock and flow. People buy things at discrete times and in discrete amounts. If you take regular shopping trips, you need to always have some currency in your pocket, unless of course you use credit cards, in which case you'll need some currency on hand to pay the bill later. So having the velocity increase without increasing currency supply would eventually result in people making hourly trips to the supermarket instead of weekly trips. It's just not practical. So if we want to change the velocity of goods and services, the currency must be flexible, either in amount or value or both. It's natural at this point to say, well yes, but don't we need a sound and stable currency in order to make sure that the volume of transactions doesn't get out of hand? That's what I used to think too, but consider this example. Spindletop was America's first large oil discovery made in 1901. The production rates available were huge, and the find led to other discoveries that were part of the Texas oil boom, which would change the fate of Texas and America together forever. You can see on this chart of world oil production the 7% per year growth between 1910 and 1973, which was largely the result of increased oil production in America. So put yourself in the position of being a leader in America at the start of this great oil boom. You see the great potential, but just don't know how to unlock it. You finally realize that it is the currency supply holding you back. At the time, the currency supply was tightly fixed to gold, which was only increasing at a rate of about 1% per year. Increasing the production of oil, primary input into just about every other good that enhances the American standard of living, would require the currency supply to increase to support the gigantic increase in the volume of circulation of goods resulting from the oil boom. So what would you do? Well, being a student of gold and silver, I'm sure you know all about what came next. The leaders embarked on a series of blunders in an effort to make the currency system more flexible to accommodate the growth that oil would enable. Credit was built up on top of gold until the credit could no longer be honored. This resulted in the bank runs of the early 30s and the calling in and revaluation of gold. Then, more credit was built up on top of gold, which eventually led to Nixon closing the gold window in 1971, ending the Bretton Woods system and putting the world on a fiat-only currency system. The problem was created because the currency supply increased by 6.8% per year to keep up with the effect of oil, but the gold supply only increased by about 1% per year over the same period of time. If currency growth was strictly tied to the amount of available gold, we wouldn't have had those awful defaults. But then again, we also wouldn't have had the explosion in American prosperity that came with the unlocking of oil as a primary source of energy. Now let me clarify something so that there is no confusion. I am absolutely not advocating for the creation of currency to try to force economic activity to happen when frugality is really what's called for. What the government and Federal Reserve are doing right now is counter to what is good for society, but there are circumstances, such as the great oil boom, that call for flexibility in the currency. The difference is in understanding the difference between when lifting a currency constraint is necessary to unlock economic activity that would happen anyway and would need to happen, versus trying to force economic activity to happen by pushing the currency supply. By now I'm sure your head is spinning, because if you're an advocate of the gold standard, I've just probably challenged one of your most deeply held beliefs. So let's together figure out what this all means. We now know that currency must be able to keep up with changes in economic activity. We know that the gold supply is difficult to increase rapidly, and so if we use it as a currency, it will put the brakes on economic growth. So what can we do about this if we don't want to have economic crises? The answer really is quite simple. Keep the gold and let it do what it does best, act as a store of value. Keep the currency and let it do what it does best, which is act as a reference point for transactions and as a lubricant to help those transactions occur. But don't combine the two functions. In other words, don't make gold the currency or tie the currency to gold. And don't attempt to save your surpluses in currency. Save your surpluses in gold or silver. This image illustrates what you can do on a personal level. It's what I do myself. I keep my savings in gold and silver. I have a small bank account with enough currency in it to fund expenses, and I only keep enough in there to fund the expenses I anticipate having in the near term. Surplus currency is traded for gold and silver, which are then stored in a secure location. When there is a need for extra currency, I just trade some gold or some silver for it. It's simple, and it keeps me from worrying about fluctuations in the currency supply or its value. So how does the government regulate the currency supply if everyone does this? Well, that's a complicated and more controversial topic. And since this presentation has probably already introduced enough controversial topics, I'll end this one here. Please feel free to comment, whether you agree with me or not. Exchanges of ideas are valuable, and that's why we're all here. Thank you very much for your attention.